Hi everyone. Can you all see my screen? Yep. Okay. Great. So hi, I'm Prema Arasu, and my seminar today is called "Sometimes an Abbey is Just an Abbey," and I'm talking about Jane Austen and Gothic satire. Feel free to put any comments in the chat. I might, Sam, is the protocol to just keep all discussion to the very end, or is it okay to have some discussion at certain points?
Usually, like whenever you want to add a bit of discussion in, feel free to do so. It's up to you how you want to run it.
Okay, yeah, we'll see how it goes. But I might raise some questions and then defer them to the end, or maybe not, we'll see. All right, so my background is I'm doing my PhD at the University of Western Australia. My Twitter's there if you want to support me or tag me in your tweets. In Australia, we like to just acknowledge the country that we are on. So the University of Western Australia is situated on unceded land of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I would like to pay my respects to the elders of that nation. So this semester, I've been teaching a unit at my university on Jane Austen, and it's been really interesting because I've been reading some of the Austen novels for the first time, and so have my class, and it's been a really fun unit. And we've done lots of adaptation, discussed lots of different things. Northanger Abbey actually is not in the unit because there's another unit on romanticism, so it's in that instead. But I think that Northanger Abbey is actually my favorite Austen novel. So I'm really glad I get to do this. So this lecture will be discussing satire of the Gothic and some of the ideas around Austen, more from an Austen studies perspective than a Gothic perspective, but we'll hopefully see how some of those interact. And Northanger Abbey is quite different, was notably different to the rest of Austen's novels in some way, which in ways which I hope might become more evident. All right. So, H.P. Lovecraft, in his essay on horror, supernatural horror in literature, said that he traced a history of the Gothic, and he said that around the 1790s-ish, the Gothic novel was now settled as a literary form, and instances multiplied bewilderingly as the 18th century draws towards its close. Gothic romances, both English and German, now appeared in multitudinous and mediocre profusion. Most of them were merely ridiculous in the light of mature taste, and Miss Austen's famous satire Northanger Abbey was by no means an unmerited rebuke to a school which had sunk far towards absurdity. So Lovecraft is quite critical here of the proliferation of tropes and the kind of what he saw as just a recombination of tropes in Gothic literature. All right, so now I just want to give some context as to when this was written, because the publication dates of Austen's novels don't really correspond to when they were written. So Jane Austen, born 1775, wrote 6 novels, or 6 complete novels: Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion. She was born into the lower gentry, and and all of her novels take place within within the lower gentry class. As a teenager, she was a writer, and early in her life, she wrote a novel called Lady Susan, which would eventually became Northanger Abbey, but wasn't published until much later. She then wrote Eleanor and Marianne, which was, again, much later published as Sense and Sensibility, and then she wrote First Impressions, which was later published as Pride and Prejudice. So she was writing a lot here, but not published. From 1801 to 1806, she moved from Steventon Abbey to Bath where she lived in accommodation she didn't really like. She was away from her family home. She didn't like the city. And the books Northanger Abbey and Persuasion are influenced by this time period. And something that we'll return to is the representation of cities, especially Bath, because I think what we take away from this period is that Jane Austen really didn't like Bath or cities in general. All right. There's also Jane Austen's lack of marriage in her life is also something that always comes up in Austen scholarship, because it's contextually important that she never married. In 1802, she accepted a marriage proposal and then rejected it the next day. We don't really know why. It's been interpreted as not marrying for love in various sort of biopics. Yes, but she was single her entire life. And that is often used to read contextually the endings of her or her novel, in which the characters are sort of married off, but the story ends at that marriage. In 1803, she sold Northanger Abbey to Benjamin Crosby, a publisher. He promised to publish it, but didn't. And I believe she sold it for a total of £10 or something. But he didn't do anything with it. Later, she moved back from Bath to Southampton, and then eventually published her earlier novel. So the first one was Sense and Sensibility, published by Egerton. This was published anonymously, so it was written as by a lady. But it was kind of a known secret that she was the author. So she was in society and people would know her as the lady who wrote Sense and Sensibility. Then Pride and Prejudice was published, then Mansfield Park and Emma. And the Prince Regent was a fan of Emma, so he was aware of the authorship. Slightly before, so just in 1816, a year before her death, Austen's brother Henry bought back Lady Susan from the publisher who never published it. And in this last year of her life, Austen was able to revise Lady Susan and transform it into Northanger Abbey. When she died, so she had 4 published novels and an unfinished work called Sanditon, but at this point, all the novels were formally published as by a lady. The year after her death, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey were published together in this. So I've got this image here is Northanger Abbey and Persuasion by the author of Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, etc. So I don't know when it identifies her, but this one didn't. But it doesn't on this page. But the biographical notice of the author was written by one of her brothers, explaining that it was the lady who wrote all these novels was Jane Austen, and these are her final books. And then her sister Cassandra destroyed many of Austen's private letters and sort of unfinished manuscripts, which a lot of people are disappointed about because it means we have very little biographical knowledge about Austen. Yeah. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is Fordyce's sermons, which was a compendium of sermons compiled by the Scottish clergyman James Fordyce, and it was titled Sermons to Young Women. By the Regency era, it was a well-known conduct book, and it was generally regarded as being rather conservative and was being subject to ridicule by writers, including Mary Wollstonecraft, who criticised it in A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Yes, Sam knows Fordyce. Okay. So Fordyce, the reason I'm bringing it up is because Fordyce doesn't like novels, or he doesn't like most novels. He likes some novels, but probably definitely not Gothic novels. So this lends context to Northanger Abbey and the sort of satire of the novel reading culture and its relevance to proper feminine conduct. So this was, dominant mode of thought, but it was also, at the same time being criticized by authors such as Mary Wollstonecraft and Jane Austen. So this is an excerpt from Fordyce's Sermon 4 on female virtue. There seem to me to be very few in the style of a novel that you can read with safety, and yet fewer that you can read with advantage. What shall we say of certain books which we are assured, for we have not read them, are in their nature so shameful, in their tendency so pestiferous, and contain such rank treason against the royalty of virtue, such horrible violation of all decorum, that she who can bear to peruse must be in her soul. It must in her soul be a prostitute, let her reputation in life be what it will. But can it be true, say, ye chaste stars, that with innumerable eyes inspect the midnight behaviour of mortals? Can it be true that any young woman, pretending to decency, should endure for a moment to look in this infernal brood of futility and lewdness? Nor do we condemn those writings only, that with an effrontery which defies the laws of God and man, carry on their very forehead the mark of the beast. We consider the general run of novels as utterly unfit for you. Instruction they convey none. They paint scenes of pleasure and passion altogether improper for you to behold, even with the mind's eye. Their descriptions are often loose and luscious in a high degree. Their representations of love between the sexes almost universally overstrained. All is dotage or despair, or else ranting swelled into burlesque. In short, the majority of the lovers are either mere lunatics or mock heroes. A sweet sensibility, a charming tenderness, a delightful anguish, exalted generosity, heroic worth, and refinement of thought, how seldom are these best ingredients of virtuous love mixed with any judgment or care in the composition of their principal characters. Right, so that's what Fordyce was telling young women, and there was this tradition of conduct books for young women. So I want to also talk about the role of reading in Jane Austen. And broadly speaking, reading, so someone who has the habit of reading in Austen is used to indicate a good character. So Mr. Darcy, he has those 7 aspects of an accomplished woman, or Caroline Bingley has some aspects, and then Mr. Darcy adds to that an accomplished woman must continually improve her mind by extensive reading. And at this point, I believe Lizzie is reading a book as well. At that scene, in another scene, he himself is reading while Caroline Bingley, who was in some ways a rival for Darcy's love, she's just reading the 2nd volume of his book so that she can get his attention. In Northanger Abbey, Mr. Tilney does read, and he has read Udolpho, and John Thorpe, who is his rival, does not read, or he's only read the more risque Gothic novels. Going back to Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Collins, the cousin and clergyman of the Bennets, visits Hertford to find a wife. After dinner, Mr. Collins suggests he reads to them, and he finds Fordyce's sermons in their library. So it's such a common book that they just naturally have it in their library. He says he's not in the habit of reading novels though, but it's highly likely here that Austen is using this very obvious intertextual allusion to ridicule Mr. Collins' character, and that conservative nature, and contrast him with Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth there. And there's a description of everyone being extremely bored as he's writing, or as he's reading out, these sermons on conduct for young women. So in current reception, Jane Austen is broadly thought of as a very witty feminist writer. And this is one example as to why she's engaging with that contemporary discourse on women and behaviour. There's a view that Austen wishes to cultivate moral, social, and intellectual virtues. Austen scholars have debated on the degree to which her works function as conduct books like Fordyce's sermons, in that they aim to also educate young women on correct behaviour, which may seem kind of contradictory because she's criticising this sermon. Some of the virtues that her books might explore include steadfastness, propriety, self-government, amiability, fortitude, temperance, loyalty, generosity, and self-knowledge. This article by Susan Allen Ford, which makes this argument, says that Austen's readers might recognise 3 major areas in which Pride and Prejudice is in dialogue with Fordyce's sermons, all of which centre on definitions of the ideal female conduct, the attractions of dangers of the witty woman, the definition of the accomplished woman, and the depiction of the virtuous marriage and family. So perhaps it's not as much as a critique as sort of a dialogue with prescriptions as to the conduct of a woman. There are both feminist and anti-feminist perspectives on Jane Austen as a moralist in sort of current discourse. The feminist perspective suggests that her novels portray a feminine take on the Bildungsroman, in that it represents a flawed heroine becoming in the world, in her society, and that they also critique the oppression and the powerlessness of women in the Regency. They uphold an ideal of intellectual love in their eventual pairings. Her heroines are flawed, but so are her heroes. Their respective emotional journeys and capacities for change are ultimately what prove their worth as romantic partners for each other. So that's the feminist perspective. The anti-feminist perspective suggests that Austen is ultimately conservative. And that's because her books end in the heteronormative fulfillment of marriage. And her books are all about independently minded women who learn to conform with societal expectations. Very young women like Lydia Bennet, who's 16, Marion Dashwood, who's also 16, and Catherine Morland, who's 18, are punished for essentially acting their age. At the end of Northanger Abbey, we have a more sort of present narratorial voice, and at the end, this narrator asks readers to judge whether the book recommends parental tyranny or rewards filial disobedience. So there is this idea that the novel has a moral message, but it's kind of asking us which message that is. So maybe that's one of the questions that we'll return to at the end. All right, so something that creates this kind of dialogue between characters and the narrator and represents different voices in Austen is free indirect discourse. So free indirect discourse is something that Austen is known for. She was one of the first writers to really use it in the way we understand now. It introduces a level of subjectivity where we may be invited to judge a character or be caught up in their mistaken beliefs, which is the case in Northanger Abbey. It's defined as a technique that presents a character's voice partly mediated by the voice of the author. The narrator takes on the speech of the character, or if one prefers, the character speaks through the voice of the narrator, and the two instances then are merged. In Northanger Abbey, when Austen describes Catherine's expedition to Northanger Abbey, the character has more prominent subjective consciousness, and readers can distance themselves from the character and examine Catherine's ridiculous and irrational behaviour and feel the ironic effects. So in Northanger Abbey, we see these instances where we get insights into sort of Catherine's internal monologue. So this particular scholar said it allows us to ridicule her, but I think it depends more on the reader, because some of us may agree with her. We may be expecting a Gothic narrative. So examples of this free indirect discourse is one particular one is here. Northanger Abbey. These were thrilling words and wound up Catherine's feelings to the highest point of ecstasy. Her grateful and gratified heart could hardly restrain its expressions within the language of tolerable calmness. To receive so flattering an invitation, to have her company so warmly solicited. So in this, we're really taken with Catherine's excitement. We're not so much encouraged to criticize her. We're kind of happy with her. But then as it goes on, her thoughts kind of become more ridiculous. So that's when I suppose we could potentially be encouraged to see how her thoughts are being skewed by her Anne Radcliffe obsession. So she's looking for evidence of what she already believes. Here was another proof, a portrait very like of a departed wife, not valued by the husband. He must have been dreadfully cruel to her. And in the last one, it was the air and attitude of a Montoni. What could more plainly speak the gloomy workings of a mind not wholly dead to a very sense of humanity in its fearful review of past scenes of guilt? Unhappy man. So there she's drawing the link between General Tilney and Montoni. So in these examples, the subjective consciousness of the character merges with the narrator, and that sort of distance narrator can sort of disappear. It's used to carry along the reader with Catherine's misgivings and assumptions about Mr. Tilney's father, but at the same time ridicules her for her inability to distinguish between fiction and reality. Okay, so next thing I wanted to talk about is the Gothic elements in the narrative itself, and whether or not Catherine can really be blamed for picking up on these things. So she shares the sort of naivety with the Gothic heroine, and she at the before visiting the Abbey in Bath, she shows certain sort of she's too trusting. She's taken advantage of by the Thorpes, Isabella and John Thorpe. And so Isabella is unfaithful to Catherine's brother and lies to both of them about it. And then Isabella's brother, who is interested in Catherine, lies to Catherine to convince her to spend the day with him, when she would much rather be with Mr. Tilney. So in that way, Bath itself, which we know that Austen did not like at all, is in a way a Gothic setting of sort of lying, and there's a sense of there's this sort of interplay of wealth, sexual desire, and sort of power dynamics, which we all see negotiated in the Gothic novel. In the Gothic novel, we also see incest is a recurring theme, and we see some sort of incestuous implications in the pairing of characters in Bath, because Isabella sort of has in mind that she will set Catherine up with her brother and she will marry Catherine's brother. And then when Catherine is possibly going to end up with Mr. Tilney, Isabella is then having a thing with Mr. Tilney's older brother. And then when Catherine visits Northanger Abbey, her father kind of makes certain comments and has sort of observations about her body. He says something about like the elasticity of her walk, something very creepy like that. So there's a sort of there's a sort of undertone of incestuous desire and family dynamics, but also mediated by, you know, wealth, owning properties, relationships prohibited, not to do with family money, and all of that. So these elements, I found an article also by Susan Allen Ford, who identifies the 7 novels Isabella tells Catherine to read. These are, The Castle of Wolfenbach, Claremont, Mysterious Warnings, The Necromancer of the Black Forest, Midnight Bell, Orphan of the Rhine, and Horrid Mysteries. Now, I haven't read any of these, so maybe Sam can tell us about them later, but there are sort of recurring themes in this which also occur in the events of the novel. So The Castle of Wolfenbach and The Mysterious Warning contain stories of women imprisoned by their husbands. So if we take into account that Catherine has been reading these, it gives context to her sort of beliefs about General Tilney and his creepy abbey. So the location of Bath is more of a Gothic setting, and that Catherine enters as an innocent young girl, and then she's lied and taken advantage of, and then she's rescued by Mr. Tilney from the villain, who is potentially John Thorpe, but Captain Tilney to an extent as well. So there are similarities with the Gothic genre in this way, between not just Northanger Abbey, but Bath itself. I have visited Bath. It was quite nice. Okay. So the last thing I want to mention is the film adaptation, which is really good. I hope that several of you have seen it. And in the unit that I've been teaching, we've been talking about adaptation a lot, because I think it would be kind of a bit snobbish to talk about Jane Austen or teach Jane Austen without talking about film, because in our sort of collective cultural imagination, most people's image of Austen really comes from film, overwhelmingly from the 1995 BBC Pride and Prejudice production, and Austen's popularity in contemporary society really went up, especially in for American women, because of that adaptation. And there's this kind of undertone that every adaptation of Austen is a participation in academic criticism of Austen. An Austen scholar called John Wiltshire, he says that scriptwriters and filmmakers can be understood as readers, and one advantage of the possibility of revision is that they make public and manifest what their reading of the precursor text is, that they bring out into the discussibly open the choices, acceptances, assumptions, and distortions that are commonly undisclosed within the private reader's own imaginative reading process. So something about this adaptation is that it's quite, a faithful adaptation. I think Felicity Jones is just such a lovable Catherine Morland. Like, she's quite silly, but she's very sweet as well. And it's very much a comedy, which I believe makes it quite a faithful adaptation. But something that is difficult to do is how do we get that dialogue of different voices? How do we get that the free indirect discourse? And in this movie, I think it's done through the imagination scenes, because the scenes which kind of draw on the genre of the Gothic novel, but also the horror movie genre, which has come from that. They make the work more accessible to a modern audience who may not be as familiar with the Gothic novel craze of the Regency period and beforehand. So it functions as a replacement for free indirect discourse in that way, as it ridicules Catherine's thoughts and her perceptions about the Abbey and General Tilney. And there are some really funny ones. So she's always in this, like billowy white dress. Mr. Tilney has got his shirt open. They're running away from General Tilney. In another scene, I think in one scene she's sort of tied to a bed or something. So it's also this expression of sexual desire. And then there's one where Isabella is sort of being ravished by Captain Tilney as well. So it's framing Captain Tilney as the Gothic villain. But Mr. Tilney is never, yes, there's a bath scene, yeah. So Mr. Tilney is always the hero who's rescuing her from the Montoni figure. And it's this dark, very much in this dark setting. So it's definitely comedic in that way and uses sort of relatable cultural motifs to give more context to something which is difficult to express, because I wanted to ask, is Northanger Abbey too rooted in the historical context of the Gothic novel reading sensation that, as we can see, was very was an issue of young women and conduct to be adapted today? Or is this done well enough to sort of transfer that background knowledge? Or rather, is there an equivalent today? Because adapting a work is often an implicit participation in its place in affirming its place in the literary canon. So the overwhelming amount of adaptations and reproductions, as well as parodies of Pride and Prejudice, tells us that that is the best, or maybe the most long-standing work of Austen, the one which has the morals that are still relevant today, while as the other works which don't have as many adaptations, such as Sense and Sensibility, that's really about the cult of sensibility in the Regency. So that's possibly a reason why it doesn't sort of speak to us as much today. And then modern adaptations such as Clueless, which is an adaptation of Emma, transfers the privilege and the class dynamics of Regency England to 90s Beverly Hills, and transfers those narratives to the high school cliques, and sort of still has that focus on female friendship. So it remains relevant in that way. So I think, yeah, I wanted to open up to that discussion of, is Northanger Abbey too rooted in historical context? Does it work today? Is there an equivalent? Does this movie convey that to an audience who may not be as familiar?
Is that is that a closing question? Or
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you okay bringing us into the group chat again?
Yes.
Sorry, like stopping screen sharing. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll just turn off the recording.